Okay, hello everybody, and welcome back from the lunch break. Next we have a panel, Sex Work Activism, Organizing and Practices of Care, which is hosted by Camille Barbagallo, who is a feminist activist and researcher and has worked extensively with reproductive labor and questions of care. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome back to the people. I'm not going to turn around, even though that's really what I feel like I want to do at the moment, to the people who are online and to our amazing audience here today. We're going to do a pretty traditional setup of having 3 presentations with 20 minutes each, and then we'll be able to have some questions and answers. I think the first speaker that we have today is Heather, who's online. And so I'm going to hand over to Heather, who'll be presenting, if you're going to be beautiful, you better be dangerous. Sex workers, self-defense as community care. Over to you, Heather.
All right, thanks so much. I'm getting quite a lot of echo.
I think that I will just need to mute us in this room.
Okay.
Someone who's more technically advanced than I am is going to do that. Sorry, Heather.
Okay. No, that's okay. It's early here, so if I have an echo too, I won't be able to quite focus. Does someone want to wave when I should get started? Okay, all right, sorry about that. All right, thanks so much for having me and everyone in the audience for being here. There's so many people involved with this symposium whose work I've been reading for a long time and really appreciating so much. So I'm really delighted to get to be here with you all, even virtually. So I'm just gonna start off with a brief content note. And that's to say that today I'm going to talk about work that's very much in progress that looks at sex workers' care for each other through community self-defense. That's my dog. It's part of a larger project on the intellectual life of the sex worker left. And by necessity, I'm talking about the forces that deal harm too. So any of the sex workers I'm engaged with here can tell you that part of community care is sometimes taking a break. So I just want to invite any listeners today to do that or mute me if this isn't the conversation you need to be having today. But I'll get started. Okay. We wake up every morning and stretch our bodies, writes the clandestine whores network of their vision for, quote, a revolutionary horizon beyond the violent contradictions of a world we wish to leave behind. There is an understanding of care. Everyone knows that the goals to be one are not based on individual but collective skill. They train in jujitsu, quote, because learning to defend from the bottom when someone is in your guard is an important way to think about how to defend yourself when you're on your back, on your bed, weighed down. Organizers also take time to dance, to rest, to strategize. The network's language suggests a war raging. The network is made up of cadres, and there is a war room. I'm interested in this language and this vision of care because I think it makes a material difference. I know it does in sex workers' lives now, but also for our purposes today because it crucially intervenes in aspects of the feminist conversation on care that I think might need pushing. I think they push back on the too comfortable, sometimes too absorbable affects of many feminist appeals for care and visions for what some feminist scholars describe as a more caring society. Part of this comes from sex workers' critiques of consumer-focused arguments for the value of care. I think sometimes doing care with Johns, a reviled sort of care recipient, can give us room to maneuver, sometimes to refuse. Sex workers largely refuse appeals based on the social necessity of their work in ways that nurses, teachers, and mothers aren't often able to. I think this sometimes equips us to think care otherwise. It can generate a vision of care that moves beyond claims for social necessity, which is to say the necessity for preserving the social as it currently exists. Part of what I'm interested in is a tension in Marxist feminist readings of care. To say that care reproduces capital is to argue for its value on those terms and sometimes can risk keeping us in place. There's a tendency to avoid class and race conflict in discussions of care. Sometimes caregivers and recipients have different opposing interests even, and this is where the language of war maybe serves. These oppositions, these contradictions won't be smoothed over by getting people empowered to value care, which is to say to value what it does for the social. And it won't be fully solved by the social democratic reforms advocated as a solution to the crisis of care, ones that preserve the racialized and feminized supply of care labor, but under slightly better conditions. It leaves me wanting a vision of care that has teeth, a vision of care that makes its militancy known, care that it aims to disrupt the social rather than to reproduce it. So that brings us back to the question of naming and the sense that sex workers' self-defense comes at a moment when sex workers are under siege. I asked Hooker's Army LA's Vanessa Carlisle about the group's name and whether I was right to read it as a kind of confrontation, even a threat. Yes, they replied. The threat is the opposite of trying to get protection from the outside through proving ourselves deserving. A lot of policy advocacy felt that way to them, humanizing the sex worker, always a woman who deserves to be protected from the harms of out-of-control masculinity. But the appeal never seems to work. It creates racist and anti-trans exclusions every time it ushers a few more people in. And the state forces being called upon for protection are too often the same ones delivering the original harm. Tactics are always questions of affect too, and there's perhaps more joy in just taking power than in having to make a case for your own humanity. And so Hooker's Army refuses that sort of appeal. Instead, it says, quote, "I don't give a fuck about any of that. If you touch me in a way I don't like, you'll get hurt." It says boundaries are, quote, mine to enforce now. Once shared, once communized, this is a militant sort of care. The army and Hooker's Army gestures to the group's intent to, quote, build a real fighting force in an oppressive system, not one that acts like the state, that kind of army, but, quote, an ad hoc guerrilla resistance movement. Carlisle thinks about what it might look like to have an outside structure, perhaps some future state, to call upon for aid in that enforcement. That'd be awesome, maybe, they said, but I also really like the idea of us being able to say no and then backing up our no's. That's foundational for any kind of movement building for me. It's also foundational for the politics of care groups like Hooker's Army undertake. So today I'll focus there. First, it feels important to name what sex workers are working against when they undertake community care. This emerges in response to the combined forces of state violence and state neglect, conditions that converge to produce sex workers' vulnerability to violence. The thinkers in this archive hail from criminalized, decriminalized, and legalized regimes and a range of orientations to left politics. But they overwhelmingly agree that across these contexts and frames, quote, if you're a sex worker, the police don't care about you, as Yoshi Maximus put it. The same institutions that deal sex workers harm can't be relied upon to protect them from it. And so if you're going to be beautiful, you better be dangerous, Maximus said. Whether violence comes directly at the hands of the state or at the high incidence of police, as in the high incidence of police abuse, or from civilians, the vulnerability to it is the work of the state. Thus, in a meditation on the victims of the Green River Killer, the sex worker poet Cassandra Troyan prefaces a naming of the overwhelmingly sex working women of color he killed with this. He said you were easy to kill because everyone already expected you to die. To do care in this context is to refuse the status quo in the states that uphold it. This care politics names the thing we're doing community care against, violence against sex workers, as constitutive of the social rather than an aberration from it. Here, I'm thinking with scholars like Audra Simpson and Eric Stanley, who make a case for violence against Indigenous women and racialized queers, respectively. Of course, these are two overlapping communities at high risk of anti-sex worker violence. That this violence is itself reproductive. That is, again, doing the white supremacist capitalist state's work on its behalf. When sex workers are harmed, this too is the state's work. And so one question I'm interested in this project is what self-valorization, that is care that reproduces us for struggle more than it does for maintenance of the status quo, might look like in this context. If we care for each other enough, might the social as we know it cease to exist? In the meantime, sex workers prefigure an alternative sociality through community self-defense. We keep each other alive, writes Sophia Rossi. Every safe call, every pack of condoms stolen from the drugstore, every recording of cops harassing workers in the street, every fentanyl test strip, every teach-in, every shared client so a friend can pay rent. Our gestures are utopian, end quote. In contesting the state's monopoly on violence, sex workers develop alternative theories of the state. This is the risk states take in dealing violence and neglect. Those very conditions set the stage for dreaming up alternative forms. That is, when the state offers nothing, it also loses some of the power attached to the performance of protection. People have such a hard time envisioning community safety without the state, without police, said Lucia Ray. But sex workers already know, they said, because the state has failed us inconsistently. And so we have blacklists and we have networks. This was in my response to the question about what they thought the civilian left could learn from sex worker organizing. Ray added, I think leftists have a lot to learn from us too, about how to organize your own community defense, how to keep your own safe and do it in a way that keeps you out of the state's grasp. We've had to. At every turn, they said, the state and these institutions have failed us. We have always found ways to survive. We are keeping each other safe. And again, when I'm thinking about care and its kind of hard edges of the self here, this is something that I want to highlight, the we. In his theory of transness and bad affect, Gil Malatino writes about rage as a crucial resource for what he calls an infrapolitical ethics of care. That is, a reliance on a community of friends to protect and defend each other from violence. This is infrapolitical insofar as it doesn't register as formal politics. And its care practice includes housing and feeding those in need, as well as other everyday forms of support, but also, quote, defending one's beloveds from forms of violence. Making sure that someone is housed protects them from harm, and so does physically defending them against street violence. And sex worker organizers of community defense work in this spirit. The same collectives keeping each other alive through housing and militant self-defense both. Like Malatino, they understand that rage needs to be coupled with repair in order to sustain ourselves. And so collectives might dream up the end of abusive Johns and cops and pursue somatic healing processes in the same session. Hooker's Army thus frames self-defense as a labor of care, both for the self and for community. Quote, members of Hooker's Army take active steps to care for ourselves and each other in this climate of predatory policing and sexist, racist, and classist attacks on our bodies, writes Carlisle. The self-defense skills the groups share include, quote, any skill that protects us, enhances our capacity to live as we choose, furthers our healing from past trauma, and strengthens us. This is caring in a very practical right now sense, said fellow Hooker's Army member Lauren Kiley. She knows it worked, she said, if people leave meetings feeling better than when they came in. Sex workers' self-defense broadly follow this general definition of what it means to defend the self. For the clandestine whores network, that includes getting rid of violent abusers, just as it does community art projects, mutual aid, rest. They follow the sense of urgency Kylie gestures to too. One of the few truths I know is that we want to protect each other in an immediate way, writes Irene Silt. This is self-defense grounded in a deep sense of interdependency. Troyan's Freedom in Prostitution brings us right here with its play on the politics of the word you. Through poems, prose, and pages-long memorial to murdered sex workers, the text figures taking sides as an urgent practice of care. You gather with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. You lose count as they try to smash you all, they write, inviting the sex working reader into identification, and I think also marking an outside for those civilians who can't claim it. You move your broken limbs and continue on as your individual body is unheroic, unassuming. The hard edges of the self are what make this interdependency possible. Like Silt, Troyan dedicates their writing to the dead, recent victims of state-sponsored murder at the hands of police and Border Patrol for Silt, victims of civilians doing the state's work for it for Troyan. This is, again, a care politics that demands taking sides. Today, writes the feminist sex worker collective Other Weapons, solidarity means fight back. Malatino invites us to refuse to hierarchize forms of care or the affects that ostensibly drive them. As radical movements know well, the state views mutual aid as threatening just as it does armed self-defense. This is not, writes Michael Sawyer, in the context of Black freedom movements historically, because of a miscalculation on the part of the state. Instead, nonviolent protest does constitute a radical confrontation with a white supremacist, quote, system of knowing. And so all these forms of care are potentially incendiary insofar as they constitute a refusal of dehumanization. In a community whose murders the state marks, in the US context at least, as no humans involved, this refusal is itself a kind of sedition. So I asked Meredith Hanlon too what the left might learn from sex workers. Their response, like Lucia Ray's, centered on exactly these practices of care. I want people to know that they are better able to take care of themselves and their communities than the state ever will. I already have a model for what it looks like when we say abolish the police. I need people to know that they are worthy of care and that care is really easily distributed amongst ourselves, but only when we realize that we're not dependent on the state. In this larger project, this is my voice again. In this larger project, I'm making a claim that sex worker theory really fundamentally reorients key questions about political life. And so for our purposes today, that means that locating sex workers in conversations of care doesn't just place or include them there, but changes what we do with care in the process. I'm going to leave it at there. I think 15 minutes is about the max for Zoom. So I'm going to leave it there and I look forward to your questions after everyone's spoken. Thank you so much.